not launched yet.
Hi, I'm Lil.
And I'm Fitz.
And you're listening to Knock Once for Yes.
It's 2020 or 2020, and neither of those feels right just yet. Luckily, I've not had to use a check in years, or I'd be putting the wrong date on them for a couple of months yet. We hope you all had a wonderful festive season and a happy new year. And a new year implies a fresh start, and we're certainly ready to shed the bad luck of last year and really make the most of this one. I really think that this year could be the year of Knock Once for Yes.
And what have we got lined up on this first episode of 2020, Fitz?
Coming up this episode, we have a pretty darn impressive ghost photo and another haunted doll on the paranormal radar. We're going to announce the winner of our Ouija board competition. We've got listener stories from Danielle, Kate and Liz, and a Ouija story that we somehow managed to miss from our Ouija special. We're also going to talk about our visit to Oxford Castle and Prison on this episode's Paranormal Postcard.
But before we get stuck into all of that, we want to say a massive thank you to our latest patrons.
Caleb Shattuck,
Amy Dalton,
Chase,
Jessica,
Cassie Luke,
Maria Plover,
Selena,
Ken Milligan,
and Annalise.
We'd also like to say thank you to Rachel Stalker for upping her pledge.
And thank you to Nikki and Linda for making a donation through Coffee.
And another anonymous supporter who donated $30.
Wow, that not only is a huge help, but it's also awesome to have a mysterious benefactor.
It is.
It has been an amazing month for Patreon and Coffee support. Thank you all so much. It is only thanks to our patrons that we can afford to keep producing the show, and we're honoured that you're all helping us to continue the journey. If you would like to help support the show, then please do pop on over to Patreon or Coffee, or follow the links on our website at knockonceforyes.com. If you find Caleb's name familiar, you might remember from last episode that Caleb has started his own podcast called The Paranormal Burrito, where he interviews people that have had paranormal experiences, so do go and check that out. As usual, I'll put a link in the show notes for you. Caleb isn't our only listener that's launched their own podcast either. We recently discovered that one of our longest standing supporters, Hilary Fatino, is the host of History on Blast. And if you have even the slightest bit of interest in history, which I presume you do if you listen to this show, then you should really check it out. Each episode, Hilary puts a person, place, time or event on blast, and she doesn't pull any punches. As usual, I'll put a link to the History on Blast podcast in the show notes so you can check it out for yourselves.
And you really should. I've enjoyed both of those podcasts. They're really fun to listen to. Now, Fitz, what has pinged the paranormal radar today?
I've got a couple of interesting ones for you this time. The first one comes from Lauriston Castle in Scotland, where a figure was caught on camera in the supposedly empty building. I highly recommend that you check out the photo, and as usual, I'll put a link to the story in the show notes on the website. Drew McAdam, a mentalist and mind reader, was performing at Magic Fest at the 16th century castle and had turned up early. Whilst waiting for the building to be unlocked, he wandered the grounds and took some photographs. It was only later, when he returned home and was looking through the photographs, that he noticed what appeared to be a maid standing in one of the windows. If it's real, it really is an amazing photo. It isn't like one of those that you need to squint at, turn 90 degrees, stand on your head and recite Mary Had a Little Lamb to maybe possibly see something that looks like a person drawn by a blind goat.
You don't even need somebody drawing one of those big red hula hoops around it.
No hula hoops required. It is clearly a person, and they appear to be wearing the stereotypical maid outfit of a dark dress with a white apron and cap. I've had a look to see if I could narrow down the era a bit rather than do the usual period dress that isn't particularly descriptive if you don't say what period you're referring to.
It is one of our personal bugbears.
It is my personal bugbear. I didn't have much luck narrowing it down, and I'm sure that some algorithm at Google has now updated some checkbox that labels me as a bit kinky due to my repeated searches for maid outfits. And trust me, you don't want to do that Google search at work. All the outfits that I could find were pretty similar. That is, all the non-kinky outfits that I could find were pretty similar. And all of them seem to have more frills and decorative embellishments than the one in the photo. On top of this, there don't seem to have been any drastic changes to the stereotypical maid outfit over the years either, so it just makes it almost impossible for me to really narrow it down without being an expert in ancient maid dresses. So, period dress notwithstanding, could it have just been a person or perhaps a mannequin? Well, apparently not. The building was locked up and empty when Drew arrived, and he had to wait for a custodian to open up the building and let him in, and the castle doesn't feature any cutouts or mannequins. Drew also notes that in successive pictures the figure appears to have moved. Commenters have speculated that it might simply have been a hoax to promote Magic Fest, but as he only noticed and shared the photo after the event, it probably wasn't the best thought out promotion if that was the case. Staff at the castle have also reported several strange experiences over the years, including hearing the sound of footsteps and rustling dresses when no one else was present, and a shadowy figure that disappears through a wall. So it seems that the castle isn't exactly a stranger to the paranormal, and perhaps this really is just an exceptional catch. Do check out the article though, using the link on the website, and let us know what you think.
I'm just having a look at the picture. I'd looked at it before, but I'm just sort of refreshing my memory. And you're right, it's either a brilliant hoax, and when I say brilliant, I mean that could just be sneaking somebody into pose, or sort of maybe bribing a member of staff to be in there when perhaps they shouldn't be and not telling anybody, or it is one of the best ghost photo captures ever. It's so clear, it just looks like there's a person standing in the window. And as you know from a lot of what Fitz and I have shared from our own personal experiences, that's a lot of the time, that's how apparitions appear. You just wouldn't know that they weren't a person were it not for the context. So this is one of those really unusual situations where it could be the best, a really, really good paranormal capture, but we'll just never know.
Yep, this is the problem with these things. Unless you were there, you're never going to know yourself.
No. Okay, now, I believe what you've got for me next is one of my favourites, a haunted doll story.
Indeed, luckily not a clown doll this time.
Ah, thank goodness for that.
It is in fact an Elsa doll from the Disney film Frozen, but it is one of those with the push buttons to make it talk dolls, and from that I'm sure you can guess where this story is heading.
To terror and fear, that's where.
It was Christmas of 2013 when a little girl in Houston was gifted the Elsa doll, which recited lines from the film and sang Let It Go when its necklace was pressed. From there, the story has a bit of a slow burn, as it wasn't until 2015 that the doll began acting up, and would sometimes talk in Spanish rather than English. Like most people, I'm sure, I would most likely attribute this to some fault on the internal electronics, and it didn't seem to bother the family too much either, as they still kept the doll for several years after this. It did, though, begin to speak when the button hadn't been pressed, and even when it was switched off. It also showed an impressive longevity, as they never changed the batteries. So far, a bit creepy, but I'd still be happy to assume that it was simply a fault with the electronics. Easy enough for me to do, being a few thousand miles away, but I've got to maintain some respectability in skeptical circles. Finally, in December of last year, they decided that it was time to get rid of the doll, and it's here that our story takes a spooky turn. They threw the doll out with the rubbish and thought no more about it until a couple of weeks later, when they found the doll inside a bench in their living room. The kids were adamant that they hadn't retrieved the doll from the rubbish, and the parents were convinced that their kids wouldn't have gone digging through the rubbish to rescue it. The doll also now would only speak and sing in Spanish. Not to be deterred, the family again threw the doll away, this time double bagging it, putting it at the bottom of their waste bin and covering it with all their other rubbish on collection day. After putting out the bin, they went out of town and again thought no more of it. That is, until sometime after their return, when one of the kids found the doll in the back garden. The family are sure it is the same doll each time, as it has some distinctive marks from being played with over the years, and that if it is a prank, they have no idea how it was done or how anybody would even have thought to have done so. A little bit freaked out at this point, the family have now sent the doll through the post to a friend in another state. Luckily this time it didn't reappear, and the friend has confirmed that it arrived safely. He has taped it to the front of his Jeep and has threatened that if it tried any funny business that he'll weld it into a steel pipe and throw it in a lake.
Well, that's certainly one idea for dealing with a haunted doll, but what... These stories seem so fantastical with the family throwing the doll out and it coming back repeatedly, but this isn't the first case where this has happened. I've heard so many stories where there's been a doll involved. Obviously, I tend to remember these particular stories, perhaps more than others, and it keeps coming back. The family try and throw it away, it reappears. I mean, there surely has to be something behind it for this to keep happening. What is going on with these dolls?
It's weird, isn't it? I mean, on one hand, you kind of like, is it fake? It's one of those things that's, it's easily fakeable. You're relying on them to tell you, but yeah, you do tend to hear it a lot. And are they just copying what they've heard from someone else? And I've heard it with Ouija boards as well, where people have tried to get rid of a Ouija board and suddenly that reappears. Don't know, unless maybe you've got some bin men that like playing pranks on you, although they'd have to have broken into your house, so probably not.
Well, I mean, that is one theory, but I mean, that's some dedicated bin men if they're going searching through everybody's rubbish just to see if they happen to have thrown away a doll.
Well, there have been some pretty dedicated pranksters over the years, but yeah, I think that's probably taking it a bit far.
Possibly.
And that's pretty much it for our Paranormal Radar stories this time. As usual, I'll put links to both those stories in the show notes on the website. We're going to get straight into our listener stories now, and this first one is a Ouija board story from Jan that we somehow managed to miss from our Ouija board special.
This non-scary spirit board experience happened to my parents. They'd just started going out, so were just getting to know each other, and had met up for an evening with some of my mum's friends at a friend's house. They decided to use a spirit board for some fun, but as my dad is very sceptical, he declined to join in. As he wasn't touching the board, they asked him to ask a question that no one would know the answer to, and therefore couldn't influence the board's answer. My dad agreed and asked the board what his dad's name was. The board correctly answered Robert Simpson. Now, of course, my mum knew that answer, but what came next, my mum had no prior knowledge of. My dad said, that's correct, but what is his real name? My grandfather had been adopted and given a new name by his adoptive parents. The board correctly answered with his birth name, George Stewart. My parents were both shocked that the board got the answer right, and neither of them have touched a board since. And after hearing that story, I haven't touched a board either.
Thank you, Jan, for sharing that story. Do you know what? I love those ones where they're just like, and it told something that nobody that was using it could possibly have known.
I know, because then normally you've got the argument of ideomotor movement, and that's, completely reasonable argument for a lot of the time. But in a case like this, you've just got to ask the question. Nobody could have possibly done that by ideomotor movement, and the chances of them doing it by accident are absolutely astronomical. Surely that's got to have come from somewhere.
Yeah, I'm again donning the skeptic hat. The only thing that you could sort of posit, I would suspect, is that she's somehow overheard it and forgotten about it over the years or something. But
even so, I mean, to then translate that into that spirit, I mean, that's pretty unlikely. And well...
Yeah, and when you're doing a board, you're not the only person that's moving it.
No, exactly. This is what I was going to say. I mean, it's not like the one person that may possibly subconsciously have the answer is the only person having influence on the movement of that board. So again, just the chances are astronomical. So thank you so much, Dan, for sending in that brilliant story. And when Fitz quite diplomatically said, we somehow missed from the Ouija board special, what he meant was, I missed it from the Ouija board special. I'm so sorry. Jan was actually the first person to send in their Ouija board story, and she was so organised that when I went back and collated all the Ouija board stories, I missed it. So apologies.
I'd never drop you in it like that.
No, you tried really hard not to, bless you, but it was totally my fault. Now, just before we get to the next story, we have mentioned on the show before that occasionally we have a little bit of a lack of stories from gentlemen for Fitz to read, but everybody's been fantastic in saying they really don't mind who reads their stories. However, if you ever do specifically want one of us in particular to read your story, and it doesn't have to be anything to do with gender, then just drop us a line and let us know. So, with no further ado, this next story is from Danielle.
I've had many paranormal experiences. Let me start by saying, for as long as I can remember, I've always been sensitive to the paranormal. I was very close with my Jido, aka grandfather, who passed away when I was about 2. Ever since then, I've always felt his presence. He was the type of man to give you the shirt off his back, so when I feel his presence, it's a calming effect. Anyways, when I was younger, I had an imaginary friend named Dido. Years later, I've come to realise that it was my Jido. Fast forward about 10 years, and I'm living with my grandma. My bedroom being my Jid's bedroom when he was alive. One night, I woke up and saw a form standing by the dresser, and I wasn't afraid. I was calm and just said, "Night, Jid," and went back to sleep. Every now and then when it's quiet, you can hear him walking the hallway. There is a board that creaks, but only if a significant amount of weight is applied to it. Also, if you sit at the kitchen table around 6:30 p.m. every night, you can see him walk up the stairs and down the hallways. It happens so fast, but it's like clockwork. Fast forward some years, and I was in boot camp for the Navy in Chicago, nowhere near upstate New York where my Jid is buried. And I see his spirit again watching over me in approval of what I'm doing in life. Fast forward another 4 years, and I'm back in New York, and my daughter, Allie, is almost 2. She would wake up in the middle of the night and point to the ceiling and say, "Jid, Jid, Jid." I've never talked about my Jid in front of Allie. We took a visit to see my grandma, and she went to my old bedroom, where Jid's dresser is, saw his picture and said, "Mommy, Jid, Jid." I still to this day have no idea how she knew who he was, because I've never shown him to her, but it just shows he's still here after 26 years.
Thank you so much, Danielle, for sharing that story with us. I love these stories. They're just so heartwarming. But what I found interesting was that this seems very much like an intelligent spirit. He's there watching over them. He's interacting with her daughter. And I'm assuming that he's spoken to her daughter to sort of introduce himself, because the daughter knows who he is. So there's some kind of communication going on there between them. But then she talks about how if you sit at the kitchen table at 6:30 p.m. every night, you can see him walk up the stairs and down the hallways.
I was just going to mention that as well. That it seems like it's a bit of both.
A bit residual and a bit intelligent. Because my first thought was, oh, well, you know, if you see him tracing the same path every night, then that sounds very much like a residual haunting. But flipping that around for a minute, everybody has their own little routine. So if he's still there in the house, sort of just going about a routine that he had in life. Perhaps it isn't a residual haunting. Perhaps he's just sort of there following his pattern as everybody does. We have our routines, and it could be that that's just what he did at 6:30.
Yeah, first impressions, it reminded me very much of Jack and my family home, that he would just sort of walk around the house and it felt comforting that he was there. We never really had so much of the communication side. We didn't get a name or anything like that.
But even so, his presence in your family home, being a member of the family, it does seem like that, again, a protective kind of spirit.
Yeah, it was very comforting.
Not, even though he's not interacting, he's there to sort of watch over, that kind of feel to it. And I love the fact that she mentions that when she saw him as a child, she wasn't scared at all. There was never any fear there. It never freaked her out. And that is just really lovely.
Fantastic story. Really enjoyed that one. Our next story is a little less heartwarming and a little more spine-chilling. This one is from Kate.
I've always been skeptical about the idea of the paranormal. I thought it was fun to be scared, but never put much stock in there actually being ghosts. However, when I began working at a prison, that all changed. The prison was built in the 1980s and used to be known as the Gladiator Camp. There were tons of fights and crazy things that happened there. In recent years, it's calmed down a lot. I was on the overnight shift and had only been an officer for about a month. It was after curfew, so all the offenders should have been asleep. There are multiple wings in a housing unit with 2 floors. So when you're on the second floor top walkway, you can feel a little trapped if you're on the side without the steps. The offenders also can come in and out of their cells to use the community restroom. I entered one of the wings and was almost done checking on all the offenders when I got to the side of the top walkway that doesn't have stairs. I looked into a cell, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a large black figure. My first thought was an offender was going to the restroom, so I didn't immediately turn to look at the figure. As soon as all that registered in my brain, the figure charged me. I stepped back and grabbed my weapon, but as I turned to engage, there was nothing there. I was super freaked out. We have to count the offenders about 6 times a day, and during the night count, we just walk around from cell to cell without waking them up. One night I was counting and came up with a larger number than we were supposed to have. I counted again, and I specifically remember counting 2 offenders in a specific cell. It stuck out to me because the offender at the desk had been the only offender awake at the time. My co-worker recounted and only counted 1. I was mad, so I took them over to the cell thinking that they just didn't look in that corner. There was no one at the desk, and only 1 guy assigned to that cell. I have other stories too, but that prison is freaky.
And thank you, Kate, for sharing that story. The prison does sound very freaky, and we really do want to hear other stories as well.
We really, really do. Please.
It's quite amusing, actually. Half of my mother's side of the family are prison officers and married prison officers, so we've got lots of sort of prison, not in prison, but looking after people in prison in the family. But
well, surely they have some stories that they need to share as well.
I will see if I can find out if there are any stories that they can recount. I don't know if they're going to be as good as this one, though.
No, but even without the ghosts, I mean, that must be a scary place to be in at night, I should imagine. And to start counting more people than actually should be in there, oh.
And if there's ever a place that would tally into the stone tape theory, it's somewhere like that, where you are in the same place day after day after day after day.
Yeah, you're right, actually, because, that's so intensive in one specific area that energy, and probably quite a lot of traumatic energy or angry energy, and it's got nowhere to go. It's got nowhere to escape to. It's not spread out anywhere. It's just concentrated in this one little cell.
They do seem to be one of the places that are quite well known for having strong activity at prisons. Interesting. But yeah, I certainly would be on edge if something charged at me, especially if you're in a prison.
You're not kidding. Yeah.
Because you're on edge. You know, you're
going to be hyper aware to start with, aren't you?
Presumably some of these people at least are going to be aggressive and potentially could threaten your life. That's presumably why some of them are in there.
Yeah. So you're going to be on guard anyway, and then, that is absolutely terrifying.
Fantastic story. Thank you for sharing that one.
And now on to our last story of today, I'm afraid. But it's a goodie, and this one is from Liz.
Ever since I was little, spirits have been a normalised topic for my family, like talking about distant relatives. You know they exist, even if they don't come around all too often. So when my family moved into an old stone house built in the early 1800s, stories of the house being haunted didn't really bother me. Honestly, it intrigued the 11-year-old I was at the time. I told my mum and dad what the kids had told me on the bus, and they responded in the same manner they'd always done. Of course this house has spirits. It's very old, and it's seen so much history, how could it not? And as long as we aren't rude to them in the house, they won't hurt us. All the stuff I'd heard before. The house itself was built on top of a limestone shelf, which is the stone material it was built out of. In the back fields used to be a running stream until they built a highway down the road, damming up the stream and creating a wetland in the back fields. In the front yard, there's a beautiful quarter-acre pond that is surrounded by trees. And all of this is plopped right in the middle of the 42 acres that came with the house. A few barns were scattered around, with quite a few pieces of abandoned farming equipment. I know there have been topics of discussion about how the presence of water can help a place's spirit activity, and I've also heard the same about limestone and other stone building material. I don't recall any previous discussions of that, but I've always thought it was interesting how the environment can have its effects. Anyway, my parents have now been living there for about 20 years, and we have all had our experiences in the house. Nothing has ever felt malicious, but certain things are still super creepy, even if not intended to be so. Today I'm going to share a couple of occurrences that stand out to me that happened while living there. Like many pre-teens, I really enjoyed drawing and sketching during my downtime. I never could get into writing in a journal every night. Instead, I would draw pictures, read, and then fall asleep. One night, while settling in, I went digging around my nightstand for my pencils, but couldn't find them. This was very curious because I usually had a number of pencils clattering around in there. I figured that I must have taken them to school without remembering, so I resigned myself to a night without sketching and just grabbed my book to read until I fell to sleep. Nothing too strange, right? Well, the next morning I woke up to find all of my blankets and sheet pulled off of me, and all of my drawing pencils piled next to me in the bed. I wondered if it could have been possible that I'd just lost my pencils in my bed without realising it, then apparently had a really active sleep, kicked all of my blankets off, didn't get stabbed or marked up by the pencils, and then they ended up all piled together next to me. Somehow, right? I sat up, said, "Thank you for finding my pencils," and then put them back in my nightstand and went to have some tea and toast. The next story always pops in my mind whenever you guys talk about seeing figures going about their normal everyday things. For this, I need to describe to you the upstairs hallway. As you go up the stairs, the hallway goes to the left, and you can find my room, my parents' room, the bathroom, and to the right is a door to the den. Now, there is a floor level difference between the upstairs hallway and the den, resulting in a step down to get into it. If one isn't too careful, you can smack your head right into the doorframe into the den as a result. Right after moving there, we all learned to duck our heads pretty quickly as we walked into the den. Lots of headaches later, we got it down. From my parents' bedroom door, you can see the top of the stairs, the den door, and the door to the bathroom. Hopefully this sets everything up in your head and it didn't become too mishmashed. One day my mum decided she wanted to clean out the closet in their bedroom. My dad was at work, so she was able to rope me into helping her sort some of their clothing out into keep or donate piles. Being the ever-motivated teenager, I wasn't too thrilled at this idea, but I agreed to help since it's tough for my parents to part with things. Anytime they feel like going through things and cleaning stuff out is a great triumph for them. Anyway, I was sitting on the foot of my parents' bed when out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a figure coming up the stairs. First, I thought it must be my dad coming home from work. When I looked up, I saw a figure all in shadow go towards the den. It was about the height of my dad, and it definitely had the shape of a person. I watched it go into the den, and I still thought that it must have been Dad, but that it was strange that he didn't come to see us, since it was obvious we were in the bedroom. I told Mum that Dad was home and went to follow him into the den. It was then I noticed that his car wasn't in the driveway, and to make sure, went looking for him in the empty room. I told my mum what I'd seen and that Dad was definitely not home. She suggested that it might have been a trick of the shadows, but I didn't buy it. It's not a trick of light to see a shadow shaped like a person duck their head in order to avoid smacking it into the doorframe, which is exactly what this shape did.
Thank you so much to Liz for sharing that story with us. That last point is really interesting because the amount of times we hear about apparitions that sort of walk through walls or where they're walking on a level that's higher or lower than the floor, and you get this discussion about, well, they're interacting with the previous existence of the house and, you know, that wall didn't used to be there. But it's more unusual that you actually get apparitions that are reacting to the house as it is in an unusual way. So that's really interesting that she saw this figure ducking to avoid hitting their head.
As if they even need to avoid hitting their head nowadays.
Well, yeah, but that kind of gives the impression that it's somebody that knew that house really well, that lived there and was practiced at not
Unless
smacking
it was
their head.
again like it was just a replay of how it used to work. You know, we were talking about the stone tape theory earlier, and I know that you picked up on the fact that it was limestone and it was water because I could see your eyes light up as I was mentioning it. So, is it just that it's just a replay of what happened? It didn't seem to interact with them at all.
Like you say, it sets the scene. The limestone, the stream that used to be there just sets the scene for a classic stone tape theory. I mean, it's interesting that the stream is no longer there, but she does say, I think the house was built in the 1800s. So if the stream was there at the time the house was built, to don my slightly theoretical hat for a moment, and at the risk of Fitz squinting at me from underneath his skeptic's hat, as he's doing right now, possibly could the stream have sort of charged the limestone while it was running? I don't know, but it's
Is it just the stream helps record it and it doesn't matter as much for playback?
Well, I mean, we don't know how any of this really works, do we? But it is certainly interesting that you've got both of those elements, and there's, you know, such a lot of activity going on there. The other thing I loved about this story was her parents' attitude to the hauntings. I just think that's brilliant, the way they reacted to it.
Yeah, it reminded me pretty much of what it was like growing up with my parents. It's like, yeah, you know, it's just the ghost, you get used to it sort of thing.
Yeah, and that obviously rubbed off on her because when she found all the pencils in her bed, instead of freaking out like some people would have done, she just said, oh, thank you for finding my pencils. That's wonderful. It's such a great attitude to have. And that line from her parents, as long as we aren't rude to them in the house, they won't hurt us. That's that's one to remember.
I think it's an attitude that would serve a lot of people. You watch the TV shows, and I know they're over-exaggerated and dramatised to make them more interesting. Yeah. But it's like, oh, it's evil and it's a demon. It's like, well, what's it been doing? Well, it knocks on the door sometimes. Yeah. It's like, not being funny, but that doesn't exactly, I can tell how it'd be unnerving, especially if you're on your own or you're not expecting it and blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't sort of scream terrifyingly evil.
No, and, we're not saying that it's not okay to be scared by this stuff. Of course, if you're not expecting it, you're not used to it, it is unnerving. We can completely understand why you're freaked out. The problem is when TV series take that attitude and run with it, and that's all that they kind of display in these TV shows is people basically overreacting. And yes, they're doing it deliberately to get more views because it's dramatic and all that. But the trouble is then that's what people take home with them when they watch these shows. And if they go on investigations themselves, or if they have any paranormal experiences themselves, it can kind of be that they feel like that's how they should react. And that makes them more vulnerable then.
Yeah, I can understand these things making you jump, but when you sort of look at it later, you think, oh, actually, it's not that terrifying and I can live with this. If that's the worst they can do, then, yeah, there's nothing to be afraid of.
Well, despite how terrifying it is, that doesn't mean it's dangerous or trying to hurt you. But we'll get back down off our soapbox for now. We can get a little bit passionate when it comes to the old paranormal TV shows, but enough said.
And that's it for listener stories this episode. Thank you to everyone that shared their stories with us. Don't forget that if you've got a paranormal experience that you'd be happy to share, then we would love to hear about it. So please do get in touch through our website at knockOncefyes.com. We're going to be telling you all about our recent visit to Oxford Castle and Prison in a moment. But first, we're going to do the draw for our Ouija board competition.
Author Alan Tigwell, who joined us on a previous episode to talk about his books Ghost in the Garden of England, also collects Ouija and talking boards and shares pictures of his collection on his Instagram Weejutorium. He's now written another book called Collecting Ouija Boards in the UK and has also created his own Ouija board, or more appropriately, talking board, and Planchette. He has very kindly provided a copy of his new book, his own Weejutorium talking board and custom Planchette to be won by one of our lucky listeners. And we've also got a couple of fun Ouija-related goodies that we'll be sending out to a runner-up.
I've written the names on some slips of paper, and being a bit old school, we'll be using the traditional method of drawing the names out of a hat. And yes, it is an actual hat. Lil's bushcraft hat, in fact. And we'll be filming this bit as well, and you'll be able to see this on Facebook when the episode is released, so you can see that we're not cheating. And so my fabulous assistant will now draw the winner of the Weejutorium Ouija board and Planchette. Drumroll, please.
Give the hat a little shake. Right. The winner of the Ouija board is Shannon.
Congratulations, Shannon. I'll be contacting you via email shortly to get your address so that we can get that out to you. And now the runner-up prize for the Ouija board goodies
is Andrea.
Congratulations, Andrea. We'll be contacting you likewise by email to get your address and get your goodies out to you ASAP. Congratulations to both of our winners. Thank you again to Alan for providing the winning prizes. Do go and check out both of his books. They are well worth a read, and I'll be putting links to both of them in the show notes on the website. Congratulations to our two winners, and thank you to everyone that entered. And if you didn't win this time, fear not, for we have another competition for you. Publishers Austin Macaulay provided us with a review copy of a new book by Jenny Kemp called Ghost Tours of Hertfordshire and Essex, and they have 4 copies of the book to give away to our listeners. All you need to do for a chance to win a copy is head over to our website, check out Lil's review of the book, and then click on the link to enter. And we'd like you to join us now on our next Paranormal Postcard adventure to Oxford Castle.
On the last day of December, a dark, grey and brooding day, Fitz and I have found ourselves climbing the uneven steps of a steep and narrow staircase that had us both experiencing flashbacks to Warwick Castle's ridiculously tall Guy's Tower. More or less waiting for the halfway point claustrophobia to set in, along with the feeling that you'll never see daylight again, we were relieved to find that the 101 steps passed quite quickly, and we emerged gratefully onto the top of St George's Tower to look across a rather magnificent view of Oxford. The first castle at Oxford was built by one of William the Conqueror's Norman lieutenants, Robert D'Oyley, but this tower is even older than that. Oxford was once a modest Saxon burh or walled town. Taking its name from the ford across the river at the south of the burh, or Oxon Ford as it's labelled on my guidebook map, the town was situated on the Thames River about 50 miles upstream from London, so a prime place for trade and travel, but also a prime place for marauding Danes to attack. Wisely, the Saxons punctuated their defensive town walls with tall stone watchtowers to the north, south, east and west. Of course, little is left of this Saxon settlement today, but somehow one of these watchtowers survived. Although for a long time St George's Tower was thought to have been part of the Norman fortifications. The original castle at Oxford was put up hurriedly after the Norman invasion, like so many similar fortifications. William the Conqueror may have staked his claim on England, but that doesn't mean the natives just happily fell into line. So the Norman leader wasted no time parcelling off tracts of land to his trusted right-hand men, essentially telling the previous inhabitants to shove off and that his lot were now in charge. As you can imagine, this didn't go down terribly well, which is why so many Motte and Bailey castles hastily sprang up all over the Norman landscape to make these key locations defensible and show everyone who was boss. Oxford was no exception, and a classic Motte and Bailey castle was constructed, a defensive ditch was dug, and the material from this was piled up in the centre to build a mounded earthwork, which was then topped with a wooden palisade. This simple construction was pretty effective, and the remains of the mound, or motte, are particularly impressive here even today at a soaring 60 feet high. But Robert D'Oyley didn't just leave it there, and in the following years set about making the castle an even sturdier stronghold, rebuilding the castle keep and bailey in stone. With this in mind, it's understandable why it was thought for many years that the great stone tower was part of the Norman fortifications built by Robert D'Oyley. But something never sat quite right with historians about that assumption. It didn't really fit with the style of typical Norman towers. So when recent archaeological excavations discovered the remnants of the Saxon town walls running right up to St George's Tower, they began to deduce that this tower, the very one we'd just climbed, was in fact the watchtower of the West Gate of Saxon Oxford. And my clumsy modern feet were now treading the same path as its Saxon defenders, as they patrolled the cold, windswept lookout, watching the horizon for Viking invaders. As I clamber up to the viewing platform with the icy winter wind buffeting me and a dizzying drop below, I did not at all envy anyone patrolling up here on a cold winter's night. But if we leave the Saxons behind for a moment and fast forward to the 12th century, the backdrop for our first ghost story finds us in this tower on a very cold winter's night indeed. The night of a blizzard, in fact, in the year 1142.
During the years 1100 to 1135, England was ruled by King Henry I, son of William the Conqueror. Henry lost his only legitimate son in a shipwreck, so he named his daughter Matilda as heir to the English throne. But his nephew Stephen, grandson to William the Conqueror, was having none of it, and claimed that his uncle had conveniently changed his mind on his deathbed naming Stephen as heir instead. Empress Matilda, however, was not about to take that lying down, and so ensued a civil war lasting nearly 2 decades, now known as the Anarchy. The easily defensible, imposing stone castles now dotting the English landscape made it difficult to gain any headway by taking territories, so the pair fought by laying siege to one another's strongholds. In September of 1135, Stephen's men swam across the rivers and water defences of Oxford, surprising Matilda's forces and taking the town. Matilda and her remaining troops retreated into the castle where they could repel Stephen's attacks and were safe for a time. But they couldn't get out, and they couldn't bring any supplies in. Such was the nature of sieges. The attacking force knew their foe could hide in those thick stone towers all they wanted, but eventually they would fall to sickness and starvation. But Matilda wasn't so easily defeated. She had already been captured by Stephen once, and had escaped by disguising herself as a corpse, a funeral carriage conveying her safely to her followers in Gloucester. She had no intention of being captured again, and so hatched a daring escape plan. Of course, there are several versions of Matilda's tales of derring-do, but our tour guide relayed her favourite, and possibly the most romantic. It was a dark and stormy night. No, really it was. A blizzard had blown into the town of Oxford, and the wind whipped billowing snow across the frozen moat outside the castle walls. Within the walls, Matilda's forces were in a sorry state. Half-starved and falling to the sicknesses of malnutrition and winter, the Empress knew that she had to break the stalemate so Stephen and his men would abandon their siege. Dressed in a thick white cloak and carrying ice skates carved from bone, she climbed the 101 steps of St. George's Tower, where her men awaited her with a long, thick rope. Steeling herself against the freezing temperatures and the dizzying drop, she was lowered over the walls of the tower to the ground, where her white form quickly disappeared into the swirling snow and ice. Too treacherous underfoot to walk to freedom, she donned the bone skates and, camouflaged by the snow in her white cape, her escape granted by the frozen river that would otherwise have held her captive, she snuck out from under her enemy's nose and made it out of Oxford to friends and safety. Matilda didn't die on that cold, snowy night, but for some reason her shade seems to keep returning to relive that dramatic night of escape. The spectre of her white-cloaked figure seen drifting up the stairs of St. George's Tower. In his book Paranormal Oxford, author Ross Andrews tells of odd lights being seen in the tower of the castle when it should have been dark and empty. He also recalls listening to the recording of one paranormal investigation group who were investigating the tower when they heard a ghostly moaning up ahead that sent them scurrying back the way they had come. Unfortunately for them, the disembodied moan sounded once again, only now it was somehow in front of them. Another paranormal team apparently got more than they bargained for when they called out for the spirits to do something, and the spirits obliged, with a racket of banging for which they could find no explanation. The author never explicitly states which tower he's talking about, but with its long history and famous ghost, we have to wonder if it's Empress Matilda's favourite haunt, the Saxons' St. George's Tower. As much as the Empress's escape on ice skates may sound unlikely in a 12th century setting, medieval ice skates were actually fairly common, and there's one on display in the castle. Carved from the long metacarpal or leg bone of a horse, and thus often called ice legs in the Middle Ages, these skates were not the sharp-bladed nippy things we have today, and users would have propelled themselves along with a pole, a bit more like skiing, I suppose.
And by the time we'd heard our first ghost story of the day, windswept and chilled at the top of St. George's Tower, we were quite ready to descend back down to ground level, although doing so meant another encounter with the claustrophobic stairway and the steps that were too small for my clumpy feet, their heights and depths deliberately uneven and confusing to deter attackers trying to climb the tower. No sooner were we back at ground level again than we were to be taken underneath it to the crypt, which, being the last day of December, was still decorated with all its Christmas finery. I can't say I'd ever thought about a crypt needing a Christmas tree before, but why not? Very pretty it was too. When entering and exiting Oxford Castle, you're required, by design of course, to pass through the well-stocked gift shop, which holds all the usual themed souvenirs you'd expect, but first-time visitors may be slightly bewildered by the large table, front and centre of the shop, absolutely heaving with figurines of King Arthur, Merlin and dragons galore. What, you may well ask, has Merlin got to do with a Norman castle? Well, it's down in the cool, gloomy depths of the crypt that we're to find our answer. To return to William the Conqueror's right-hand man for a moment, rebuilding and fortifying Oxford Castle in stone wasn't all that Robert Doyley did during his time in charge. He also repaired many local churches, after a nightmare in which he was brought to account for his sinful ways that spurred him to embark upon some good works to try and balance his score sheet. One of the ecclesiastical buildings he founded was actually in the castle itself, a Collegiate Church dedicated to St. George, thought to have supported not only clergy, but also a small number of students. In fact, many believe that St. George's Chapel in the castle was actually the humble beginnings of the university colleges for which Oxford is now so famous. What we do know for sure, though, evidenced by the charters of Robert Doyley, is that one of the studious chaps in residence was one Geoffrey of Monmouth, who moved to Oxford from Wales in 1129. During his time at the castle, he authored several books, including Historia Regum Britanniae, better known as the History of the Kings of Britain, and the Prophetiae Merlinae. In other words, Geoffrey was the first author to write about King Arthur, Guinevere, Lancelot, and of course Merlin. Obviously, these days the stories have been retold so many times that they really have taken on a life of their own. So it's fascinating to realise that the first time they were written down was right here in 12th century Oxford. And for many years after their publication, these books were apparently considered to be an accurate account of British history, right up until the 16th century when the Tudors challenged this long-held belief. Unfortunately, the chapel itself is now gone, torn down to make way for the 18th century prison redevelopment, and all that remains is the crypt that once lay underneath St. George's Chapel. As we enter the chilly, dark, subterranean space, the decoratively arched columns give it a solemn and rather fittingly church-like feel. Our guide delights in telling us that due to the constant cool temperature in the crypt, it was often pressed into use to store bodies until they could be buried. This on top of the more recent archaeological discovery that the chapel was probably built on top of an old Saxon burial ground. It doesn't seem to be the unquiet spirits of Saxon warriors skulking in the shadows, though. No, this is the favourite spot of a certain grumpy monk. On a quiet night, you may just hear the ethereal sound of ecclesiastical singing drifting through the columns of the crypt. But more often, what unwitting paranormal witnesses hear is profuse and disembodied swearing. In one particular corner of the crypt, the shadowy form of a monk has been seen. On the castle website blog, one staff member recalls not only seeing the dark figure sitting in this corner, but also smelling him, as in addition to his filthy language, he's well known for not smelling too clean either, and is often accompanied by the stale stench of beer. This unwholesome apparition has become so familiar that the staff have named him Bernard, and they even refer to that area of the crypt as Bernard's Corner. They theorise that he may have been secretly brewing beer down in the crypt while his brethren were up in the chapel at prayers. One visitor may have even captured a photograph of Bernard whilst on a ghost hunt with the Fright Nights Paranormal Events Company. We'll link to the article in the show notes. The photo quite obviously shows a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the crypt, but whether or not it was the grumpy ghost of Bernard, we'll leave up to your own judgment. Our tour guide invited us all to take a turn standing in Bernard's Corner to see if we would encounter the Phantom Monk. We jumped at the chance, but didn't really feel anything spooky down there, more a slight lingering feeling of busyness if anything. Although one visitor had a slightly more unnerving experience, as was later recounted in the castle website's blog. The visitor in question had a guide dog, who up to this point in the tour had behaved impeccably, as you would expect from a guide dog of course. But approaching the entrance to the crypt, the dog's demeanour changed entirely, stopping dead at the entrance to the crypt and refusing to go in. After much coaxing, the dog reluctantly entered the crypt, but soon afterwards began whining and growling at something the rest of the tour group couldn't see. Eventually unable to take any more, the growling erupted into frantic barking before the dog turned tail and ran out of the crypt and up the stairs. It takes a lot for most guide dogs to abandon their humans, so this dog must have been terrified by whatever it encountered down there.
When we left the crypt, we were in many ways leaving the Saxons, the Norman castle, the chapel with its monks, and the military stronghold behind, and moving into the castle's later incarnation as a prison, both figuratively and literally, as we walked up the stairs from the crypt and straight into the long stern corridors of D-Wing. Of course, the castle dungeon had been used to imprison captives for as long as it had been in existence, and the castle was used as a jail by the county sheriffs from as early as the 13th century, with one corner always put aside for students being punished for being drunk and disorderly. Some things haven't changed much since the 13th century. But over time, the castle's military functions became less important, and its function as a prison progressively more so. And so we'll move forward to the 16th century, to the year 1577 to be precise. The country was in the midst of the religious turmoil of the Reformation. With Catholics and Protestants pitted against each other, the castle was being used as the county court, and Oxford was about to hold an assize, which would end in a terrible curse. The curse of the Black Assize. In the days before Crown Courts, the courts of assize were how counties dealt with criminal and civil law, and the case that came before the judge on that fateful July day of 1577 was that of Roland Jenks, a Catholic bookseller who stood accused of allegiance to the Pope. Jenks was found guilty, but upon being sentenced to lose his ears, he retaliated by pronouncing a dark curse upon the jury, the court, and all of Oxford. According to contemporary accounts, no sooner was the curse uttered than a foul stench rose up in the courtroom, fairly smothering all within. And almost immediately after, people started to sicken from a terrible and mysterious disease. The illness supposedly driving the afflicted to fling themselves in the river to escape the pain. The death toll rocketed up into the hundreds, and amongst the fatalities were many prominent figures from the Jenks trial, including 2 judges, the sheriff, the coroner, a clerk, and others present in the courtroom. Of course, outbreaks of sickness and disease happened often in prisons, and jail fever was a frequent malady. But what was so unsettling, and some said supernatural, about this outbreak was that it somehow avoided women, children, and prisoners, none of whom were recorded as affected by the illness, whilst it seemed that those in positions of power perished, almost as though Jenks had willed it so. The sickness raged for a month, finally vanishing in August as mysteriously as it had appeared. The courtroom was eventually demolished, and its replacement still stands today. On a wall inside the main hall is a plaque erected in 1875 which reads, "Near this spot stood the ancient Shire Hall, unhappily famous in history as the scene in July 1577 of the Black Assize, when a malignant disease known as jail fever caused the death within 40 days of the Lord Chief Baron of the Exchequer, Sir Robert Bell, the Lord High Sheriff, Sir Robert Doyley of Merton, and about 300 more. The malady from the stench of the prisoners developed itself during the trial of one Roland Jenks, a saucy, foul-mouthed bookseller, for scandalous words uttered against the Queen." To add further fuel to the now legendary tale, during excavations of the castle ditch in 2003, a large number of human skeletons were found, the remains dating to the late 16th century. We'll probably never know for sure, but these bodies could just be some of the victims of Roland Jenks' curse of the Black Assize.
The long corridor of D-Wing looks cold and uninviting. The lonely single string of leftover Christmas lights twinkling bravely in the shadows, but barely making a dent in the dismal gloom. And of course it's meant to look uninviting. The small cells uniformly placed along its length illustrates a perfect example of the sterile uniformity of a prison from a more modern era. But before the prison reforms of the 18th and 19th centuries, sterile is certainly not a word associated with the castle's cells. Earlier in the castle's history, inmates would be kept in appalling conditions with little or no sanitation. Jailers weren't paid a wage and earned their living extracting money from the inmates one way or another, with the inmates somehow expected to pay for their keep whilst locked up. As we are taken through each cell, we see examples of the different conditions for inmates dependent on the period of history and upon the wealth of the prisoner. Some cells are tiny with nothing more than a thin, hard mattress on the floor and a bucket in the corner. The cells of the more wealthy, however, are much more lavish affairs and over twice the size. The one we peep into even has a quaint table set with a tea service. Obviously, this prisoner was expecting visitors. One prisoner who may well have enjoyed such comparative luxury and special privileges was Mary Blandy, a young lady of middle-class background, and the type of gentlewoman you would far more easily imagine sitting down to afternoon tea than being incarcerated in Oxford prison. But incarcerated she was, and for the murder of her father, no less. At the ripe old age of 31, the unmarried Mary was considered, by the standards of 1752 that is, to be practically a spinster. Her father made a rather desperate attempt to get her swiftly married off by loudly boasting and exaggerating to any gentleman within earshot about how rich he was. Unsurprisingly, this elicited a fairly swift increase in interest for Mary's hand, although not necessarily from the most reputable characters. Enter Captain William Henry Cranston, Scottish aristocrat and army officer, to sweep Mary off her feet and whisk her, and her father's money, off to the altar. And the marriage might just have gone ahead were it not for the fact that Mary's father soon found out that Cranston was already married with a wife and child tucked away in Scotland. Having finally figured out that the captain was just trying to get his grubby mitts on Blandy's fortune, the wedding was called off, and Mary's father forbade her from any further dalliances with the rogue. But Mary was lovesick, and by all accounts, very naive, impressionable, or probably both. Cranston continued to correspond with Mary, assuring her that his other marriage wasn't legal, like that made it okay, and convinced Mary that all her father needed was a little love potion to sweeten his mind to the idea of their wedded bliss. He sent Mary just such a love potion, with instructions to administer it into his food. She duly did mix the white powder in his food, and was spotted doing so by the servants. So when her father swiftly sickened and died, and it was revealed that the love potion was actually arsenic, Mary was immediately suspected of the crime. She was tried in March of 1752, and whether or not she truly believed she was innocently mixing a love potion into her father's dinner, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to be hanged. Her trial was excitedly reported at the time because it was unusual and scandalous to have a genteel lady of society held on murder charges. She was hanged in the castle courtyard, and back in the 18th century that wouldn't have been a private or even necessarily solemn affair. As our tour guide demonstrates the trapdoor lever mechanism of a replica gallows, she tells us how a hanging such as this would have been a public event. All the locals would have turned out for the festivities, bringing their children and gathering on the castle mound to watch the proceedings. Hangings, it seems, were big entertainment in the 18th century. Maybe it was the horror of this spectacle endured by Mary. Maybe it was the guilt at what she'd done. Or maybe it was the heartbreak of being tricked and left to hang by the man she loved. Whatever the reason, Mary's restless spirit never quite managed to escape the castle, and her pale apparition can still be seen drifting forlornly about the castle mound. Author Ross Andrews details one such sighting of Mary in his book Paranormal Oxford. An account given by a tour guide at the visitor attraction who was standing at the castle mound, telling his tour group all about Mary's story and about her ghost. At this point, a strange white light appeared on the mound. The tour group watched in fascination as the glow slowly took on the form of a woman and made its eerie way along the path up the mound. They were all delighted with the entertainment and refused to believe that it was not, in fact, an effect put on for their benefit, or that there shouldn't have been anything at all to see on the mound that night. To this day, the tour guide may be the only one to realise what an extraordinary sighting of Mary's apparition they really witnessed. Another tour guide tells on the castle blog of his own encounter with a supernatural force after telling Mary's story to a group of tourists. Having returned to the staff room after his tour had ended, he closed the door firmly behind him so that he could change in privacy. The door he'd just shut suddenly flew open, and another door quickly followed suit, crashing open loudly. Now you might wonder if perhaps a draft had somehow entered the room, with the first door creating a vacuum that opened the second, but these doors opened in opposite directions. The second to open was a fire door which should have been secure, and there seemed to be no explanation as to what flung the first door open, unless, the guide wondered, was Mary showing her displeasure at his recounting of the story of her life and death. When we'd finished exploring D-Wing and the round Debtors Tower showing mugshots of real 19th century prisoners, some of them as young as 7 years old, and the replica treadwheel used for Victorian hard labour punishment, and the padded cell that once held the notorious killer known as the Black Panther, we were quite glad to step outside into the fresh air and explore the castle mound. It's a pretty steep climb, the highest motte I think I've ever been up. It had been raining, it seemed, for months. The ground was slick and muddy, and the path thin and winding, as we clambered up onto the precarious peak of the mound. The views over Oxford were amazing, but I spent rather more time looking at my feet to ensure I didn't misstep and plummet off the side of the slippery motte. And while we were up there, I watched in horror as someone not paying due care and attention to their footing went slithering down the slick grass perilously close to the edge. You certainly do get a good view of the castle courtyard up here. It felt like we were almost at eye level with the top of St. George's Tower. But despite the great vantage point, it's hard to imagine with the modern mind the throngs of families lining the slope, all enjoying a grand day out as they watch some poor soul being hanged in the courtyard below. There's another stark reminder to bring it home though once we get back down to the bottom of the mound, reading an information board about the many bodies that have been found by archaeologists in the castle yard, many of which had been dismembered before being interred. More than likely, these were criminals whose bodies were used for medical research before being returned to the castle where they were executed.
Over the years, we've visited many castles that once served as prisons, but mostly these fell out of use in later years as time took its toll and the buildings crumbled and deteriorated. It's surprising that this hasn't been the case at Oxford, especially as parts of the castle were destroyed after the Civil War. During the fighting, King Charles had taken up residence at Christ Church College for a time, and Oxford Castle was used to incarcerate prisoners of war. The conditions the prisoners were kept in were some of the worst the castle had ever seen, and after the war was over, scandalous tales began to emerge about the filth in which the king's men had kept their captives. The castle became such a hated symbol of abuse to the parliamentarians that they set about destroying the fortifications and the hated reminder of royalist cruelty. Unfortunately, despite at least one of these reports of the horrifying prison conditions making it to print, in a pamphlet titled The Inhumanity of the King's Prison Keeper at Oxford by Edmund Chillenden, conditions for incarcerated criminals wouldn't improve that much until the prison reforms begun by the High Sheriff of Bedford, John Howard, when he published his book The State of the Prisons in 1777, in which he called for change to the inhumane conditions of prisons. One of the prisons he visited in his research, which led him to realise how horrifying the current situation truly was in fact Oxford. Instead of being abandoned and left to rot like so many castles condemned by the prison reforms, Oxford was radically rebuilt over the course of 20 years. In reality, this may have saved the castle from being lost to time entirely, as these reforms created a prison that would remain in use right up until 1996. By this time, thankfully, the prison was a much less barbaric place, with proper sanitation and medical care, but all the renovation and rebuilding didn't stop the castle's ancient spectres from skulking in the shadows of the prison's long hallways. The prison guards encountered an inexplicable white mist that floated up a staircase while they watched, before fading away as mysteriously as it had appeared. The sound of disembodied footsteps were heard pacing the corridors. A patrol dog reacted to something supernatural in much the same manner as the guide dog we heard about earlier, abruptly halting and starting to growl menacingly. Only this time the dog wasn't growling at something unseen by human eyes. The prison guard could see what was so upsetting his dog. A dark, shadowy figure, which then vanished before his eyes. The prisoners themselves only added to the castle hauntings when a séance between inmates in the 1970s went horribly wrong, causing poltergeist activity that resulted in an exorcist being called in to try and put an end to the phenomena. although it certainly didn't put an end to all the phenomena, as paranormal occurrences are still being reported today. One member of staff was terrified to witness the door of an empty lift rattling and shaking as though someone was trapped inside, whilst another, walking through D-Wing after hours when the castle should have been quiet and still, heard the sound of a woman's laughter coming from an empty cell. We found Oxford Castle to have a definite atmosphere, more so than a lot of more famously haunted locations. I have to wonder if any of this is down to the fact that it hasn't been open as a tourist attraction for very long at all. Only since 2006, in fact, after a restoration following the final closure of the prison in 1996. Perhaps the resident ghosts aren't all that used to or bored of the tourists yet, and are more willing to come out and play.
It is a really atmospheric place, particularly in certain areas, and they do run ghost hunts there from various paranormal events teams. So it is a place I would love to investigate if we ever got the opportunity. You had some experiences there, didn't you, Fitz?
I did have a few. They tended to be very specific. When we first went up the tower, I didn't get anything at all from the tower.
No, me neither.
And when we came back downstairs again, I was beginning to think that I wasn't really going to get much from the place.
Mm-hmm.
But it was when we went into the crypt, and it didn't feel bad, it didn't feel oppressive or anything like that, but it felt crowded. Now, the tour was quite good actually, because we got to go on the tour, and then when it's finished, we got to go and explore on our own.
Which was brilliant.
Which was really, really good. And I still, when we went back to the crypt after the tour, I still felt that crowded feeling, even though it was just the two of us in there.
I know, none of the other tour guests actually went back down to explore, did they? It was just us. They were quite happy to bimble off back down to the tea room.
Yeah.
So we had the place to ourselves.
It was great. We, between tours, we literally had the whole place to ourselves, and it was fantastic. Didn't notice Bernard, didn't feel anything in Bernard's corner.
Didn't smell Bernard.
But it almost felt like there was kind of like a cocktail party, just a sort of gentle, social, like I was not necessarily being ignored or noticed or nothing specific. It was just like I was just part of something that was going on around me.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It's I could feel a certain charge in the air, almost like when you walk into a crowded room, and even if you had your eyes shut, you could just sense that there was a lot of people in there, that kind of feeling, a sense of busyness, of a great activity that is either just finished or you've just missed somehow. Which
is odd, because presumably it wouldn't have had much in the way of that going on in its history at all, other than the tours, and that would only have been sporadic. So maybe that's a case because there would have been a river next to it originally.
Yes, there would have been water all around. There would have been a moat. There was a mill stream that originally ran past the castle, and that was diverted to create the moat. So, yeah, water everywhere.
Yeah, built of stone. Maybe, again, going with the stone tape theory, it's just recording the crowds of people that go through.
Yeah.
And I just got picked up on that feeling of crowds from it.
So going into D-Wing, you had a bit of a phantom smell.
Well, I didn't even get to that bit first, because I saw something at the end of the corridor as we were coming out of the crypt.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
I just saw this flash of light above head height across the wall, and bearing in mind we were underground, there was no windows, all the lights were fixed and static, we were alone. There wasn't anything that should have been there.
No, and we did go straight down the passageway and look up the stairs to see if there was anybody else around that. I mean, the thing is, if somebody had come down that staircase, we would have heard them. They're stone steps, and we hadn't heard anybody come down. But even so, we ran out to check, and there was nobody in the vicinity. There was, our tour group was long gone on a different floor, different part of the castle entirely. The tour group following us had gone up St. George's Tower, so they were nowhere to be seen. So there was nobody that could have walked in front of a light and caused a strange effect.
No, and there weren't even any lights that you could have walked in front of.
No.
They were ceiling mounted at that point, so there wasn't really anything that could have caused it.
No, unfortunately I just missed all of it, I think.
No, it was weird. And then, like you say, going upstairs onto D-Wing, there was a room, and it smelt like freshly carved wood.
Yeah, it was weird. There was not a nice feeling in that room at all. As soon as Fitz smelled that, I went back and had a look in the room and had a scout around to see if I could find anything that might have been sort of giving off that smell. But there just wasn't anything at all. But on going in there, it did make me feel quite unwell. There was definitely a strange sort of heavy atmosphere in there. It wasn't nice.
No, I didn't get much of a feeling in there. It was a little bit sort of oppressive, but I don't know if that was just me reacting to what you'd said, but I didn't get much out of it. Literally just the smell. It was really strange. After that, I think the strongest feeling I had was in the Debtors Tower.
Yeah, for sure. The Debtors Tower, it's kind of this round tower room. It's very much sort of decked out in wood, isn't there? There's like wood everywhere. But it had this really headachy, oppressive, sicky kind of feeling to it.
Yeah, you've got sort of iron bars up that divided the room into sections, and they had pictures of the people that were in prison there. But literally the second I walked in there, I got a headache, and it felt like something was squeezing my skull. And I thought, I'm just getting a headache. This isn't very good. As soon as we left the room, it went. And I was like, okay, this is a bit weird. And this was just before the end of the tour. So we were still sort of moving through and following on and listening to the guide and blah, blah, blah. And then when we finished the tour and started to go back, when I went back in that room, again, bang, headache straight away. As soon as I cleared the other side, gone.
Yeah, and he cleared that room very quickly the second time around because you just walked into that headache and went, I'm off, I'm leaving, I'm getting out of here.
I just couldn't stand in there. It was horrible. And it wasn't agony or anything, but it was enough that I was like, I don't want to stand in here for any length of time. I'll walk through it, but it wasn't a very comfortable sensation.
No, not at all. One of the weirdest things for me, nothing paranormal at all, but is seeing the hotel. So one of the ways that they've managed to keep Oxford Castle open, they're, very clever about the way they're sort of funding it to make sure that, it is open to the public and we have this wonderful opportunity to see it. But part of the old prison, they've turned into a hotel, a very fancy, swanky hotel called the Malmaison.
Well, it's kind of fancy, swanky, and the rooms are, because we looked it up later.
Yeah.
And I've got an almost paranormal blooper for you here. Because there's a little balcony off the second floor of the Debtors Tower.
Yeah.
And I went out to walk on that, and I walked up to this window alongside the prison, and I didn't realise that was the hotel. So I look through this window, and I can see what looks exactly like a Victorian prison, other than the fact that there's a big Christmas tree down the other end. And I was like, wow, that is both pretty and decorative and quite scary that it's a prison. And I was busy admiring the view when all of a sudden a cleaning lady walked past the window directly in front of me and made me jump back in shock because I wasn't expecting to see anybody in it. Because I didn't realise it was a hotel at that point. I thought it was part of the tour, or we'd be able to go and look at it at some point later, and it was just the prison. And it just made me leap back in shock that somebody walked past the window like 2 feet in front of my face.
To be fair, it wasn't clear at all it was just like a little balcony, wasn't it, off the Debtors Tower. You could go out and get a breath of fresh air sort of thing. And then, you peered straight into these big glass windows that went directly into this hotel. But there was no sign up saying that's what it was. You didn't realise until you sort of stood there peering into it for a little while. And it was just the oddest thing because they've really maintained the architecture and like the staircases. It looks like a prison. There is no mistaking it. It's got the long galleries with the doors either side, sort of punctuated along these galleries uniformly where the cells would have been. So the cell doors are still there. The hotel room doors are the original cell doors. They've kept those. And what they've done is they've knocked 3 cells together. So you've got 2 cells that make up the room, and then the third cell is the ensuite bathroom. But they haven't really changed the exterior of sort of the atrium. So
No, it's clearly a prison.
Yeah.
To be fair, when the Victorians built a prison, they built quite a tasteful looking prison.
It was decorative,
at least for the main areas. So there's wrought iron everywhere, and it's very, very, very Victorian.
Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to describe. The Victorian sort of standard being, even the utilitarian stuff was decorative. So it once looks both utilitarian and Spartan and sparse, but also decorative.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We'll put a link in the show notes actually for the hotel,
yeah.
so you can have a look and see. And some of the rooms are incredible. There's some that they've knocked through 2 levels.
Yep.
So you've got a sort of mezzanine bedroom that opens out onto a lounge area with a big TV.
Cool.
It looks amazing.
I would love to stay there. Also, the punishment rooms of the original prison were where the hotel is now, and they are still there, even the corporal punishment room, but they're not cells that you can sort of hire out. So they're not open to the public. They're used as sort of staff rooms, but they are still in existence. And I think I read somewhere that they've kept a cell sort of done up as it would have been, so that visitors can actually see it if they want to. So that's sort of set aside in the hotel.
Oh, perhaps one day we'll have to see if we can stay there and have a look.
That would be pretty cool.
But I think sort of paranormal-wise, that was pretty much it. I don't think there was much else I experienced there. And again, the debtors bit was just the worst bit with my head.
Yeah, nothing really much happened, but it just had a vibe to it. It had a real atmosphere, and I just felt like if you were to go there at dusk and it was quiet without the visitors, stuff would happen. It's just got that feeling about it. It's just written all over it. And I do think that the fact that it hasn't been exposed to so many visitors over years and years and years, like a lot of these locations have, I do think that would play into it a bit.
Definitely.
So I'd really love to get in there at night.
Indeed. And if you enjoyed hearing about our adventures at Oxford Castle and want to see some of what we're actually talking about, there is a video of our visit available to our patrons. You can become our patron from as little as $1 a month, and your support will help us keep producing the show and visiting lots more haunted locations.
We had some great feedback from this video, so thank you so much for that. And a lot of our patrons commented that they really liked the video content, but also getting to see some of the behind the scenes stuff. So we're going to try and do some more of this type of content in the future. We've already been busy filming some day in the lifestyle content from our latest road trip. So patrons, look out for that coming to your Patreon feed very soon.
And that is all we have time for this episode. Thank you to everyone that shared their stories, to Alan Tigwell for providing a copy of his latest book and Ouija board for the competition. A huge thank you to all of our patrons and coffee supporters, without whom the show wouldn't be possible. And thank you to all of you for listening. We hope you'll join us next time for another Knock Once for Yes.
You think he's listening?